everybody for joining us today as we take a journey through the do's and don'ts of showing property during this COVID-19 pandemic world that we are currently in. Jordan Nunez and myself make up the staff component of our SCCAOR advocacy team. And as Spencer said, we will begin with a PowerPoint presentation today, taking us through some of the do's and don'ts of showing property during COVID-19, and then after that, we will open it up to any questions you all may have in the audience. So I'm going to start sharing my screen and we will get the presentation rolling. So as was said, this is going to be the real estate transactions during the COVID-19 pandemic, some guidelines and regulations to your listings and anything real estate related. We do have the contact information down below for our SCCAOR advocacy team. If you do happen to miss anything during the presentation, feel free to reach out to us. And also any of the documents or links that I reference in the PowerPoint presentation this afternoon is all available on our SCCAOR Transaction Resource Center, and we will have a link to that at the end of the presentation. So to understand where we're at right now in terms of what real estate activities are deemed essential, I think it's beneficial to take a little bit of a glimpse through time the past couple months as this COVID-19 pandemic has evolved. And I know for everybody, it feels like it's been several years in this new strange world that we're in, but it actually has only been a couple of months. So let's go back to March when the COVID-19 pandemic really started to take a turn for the worst, and a shelter-in-place ordinance was released at the local, state, and federal levels. Now, when these first dropped, real estate was deemed essential at the state and federal levels, but not necessarily under the original county ordinance. The county recorder's office pretty swiftly closed for all person activities, but we immediately were able to establish with them an online submission process so that any virtual transactions could continue to close and move forward. Then briefly after that, we started working with county elected officials and staff to get real estate deemed essential through the shelter-in-place ordinance at a very limited capacity. We weren't allowed any individuals, professionals, listing agents on any listed properties, and we could do virtual tours only. Then shortly after that, SCCAOR quickly worked to effectively create our PED forms, which you all know and love by this point, to follow real estate restrictions during the COVID-19 pandemic, and they do still need to be signed electronically opposed to in person. Once we started moving into April, the county released a new updated shelter-in-place ordinance that did ease some restrictions for real estate requirements. First, private showings were now allowed on vacant properties when we previously were only allowed to do virtual tours. Next, we were able to carve out professional photography and videographers allowed on all properties, whether occupied or not, to facilitate those virtual tours. After that, appraisers and inspectors were included in that same classification as photography as deemed essential and allowed on all properties, even occupied, as long as the occupant was not home. And as we started moving into the more sophisticated shelter-in-place ordinances, the county did implement that social distancing protocol that all businesses needed to fill out. And we will touch into that a little bit later. There is a new social distancing protocol that you need to fill out, and I will go through those steps with you. Once we moved into May, we again had another shelter-in-place ordinance released that again released restrictions again. We were now allowed to have private showings on occupied property as long as the resident was not home. It was restricted to a max of 2 people from the same household with 1 agent at a time during the private showing, and it was strongly suggested that it be the listing agent opposed to any buyer's agents. We were then able to get stagers carved out in the same classification as photographers and videographers as essential for all listed properties. And again, private showings were only able to occur if a virtual tour was infeasible. And then to close out the month of May, many affiliates, landscapers, gardeners, residential construction and improvement projects were all allowed at residential homes again. As we started to move into the summer months, the county started to move away from the shelter-in-place ordinances and into the risk reduction orders that we now are a part of, and those have been updating every couple of months. But the protocols did not change for a couple of months. During the summer, we moved into a groove a little bit of showings remaining unchanged. It was always a max of 2 people per household allowed at a private showing. This was followed up at the state level, the releasing of the industry requirements for real estate transactions, which became the statewide authority on how showings could move forward. But if county restrictions were more stringent, you still needed to follow that. So CAR did release guidelines on those industry requirements for showing property, but our county ordinances through the summer were always more restrictive. There were extensive cleaning protocols that were implemented for private showings to increase sanitation, decrease risk, decrease contact spreading, and those are still in effect to these days and should be followed. Early on in the pandemic, at a statewide level, the term open house in any sense was banned and not allowed to be used during promotion. This was loosened up in July, I believe, to allow open houses by appointment only. You could not use the term open house by itself, but it could follow by appointment only on a rider or any sort of sign. And as you can see below that, traditional open houses were and still are currently prohibited. And when I say traditional open house, I mean in the sense of a normal pre-COVID world where you're just having people flow in and out through the listing at ease. Later on in the summer, as new risk reduction orders were released, brokerage offices were allowed to reopen to the public. It is still strongly encouraged that any work a broker or a real estate agent in an office can do virtually should be done virtually, but similar to the showing guidelines, if infeasible, brokerage offices were able to reopen to the public. The state then moved us further away from the earlier shelter-in-place ordinances into a blueprint for safely reopening the economy. And as you all know now, we are in a 4-color tiered system, with purple being the most restrictive and yellow being the least restrictive in terms of what the state allows county ordinances to implement. Santa Clara County started in the purple, and as we moved into the fall, we started to move into less restrictive tiers. So as we moved into September, Santa Clara County moved from the purple into the less restrictive red tier. However, indoor gatherings in the red tier were still banned, and there implemented no real changes to the real estate transaction when we moved from the purple into the red tier. However, a couple of weeks ago in October, Santa Clara County was finally cleared to enter into the orange tier, which triggered a new risk reduction order in which indoor gatherings were no longer banned, which did loosen some of the restrictions for showing property, which I will get into a little bit in the next slide. The 2 main changes in this new risk reduction order were all companies were now required to fill out a new social distancing protocol. I said I would get into that more. Any companies that filled out a social distancing protocol earlier in the year, in the spring or the summer, that one became invalid. And with this new risk reduction order that was triggered in October, the new social distancing protocol was implemented along with the less restrictive guidelines. And with this new less restrictive order, the state industry guidelines finally became more restrictive than what Santa Clara County allowed, and have now become the governing authority on what you can and cannot do when listing a property, which brings us to today and what you are currently allowed to do. First and foremost, and I cannot emphasize this enough, traditional open houses are still not permitted. Private showings can occur via appointment only, and they should be made by electronic appointment prior to showing the listing. Drive up or walk up appointments should not be allowed. We should be doing electronic appointments and signups only to limit the amount of gathering that is done outside of a listing, and to ensure that there is enough time to properly clean and disinfect each listing to abide by those industry guidelines for cleaning protocols for real estate transactions. As I said, the restrictions for showings in terms of who would be allowed in at one time did loosen up a little bit. Previously, it was a max of 2. Now we are allowed a max of 1 buying party per private showing. and that is very vague, and I will go into that a little bit more. A buying party could be anything up to an entire family. So a family of 6. Previously, all of the children would not be allowed into the private showing at one time. They were very firm with the max of 2, whether it be adults or children. So now an entire family can go through and tour that home at one time. Any number of investors going on in an investment property together, whether it be 6, 7, 8 investors, all from different households, that are all going to be listed on the title or the deed. That would all be considered one buying party. If it's a multi-generational issue where maybe some grandparents or parents are going to be helping out their children or grandchildren with maybe a down payment or some financial assistance, that would be included in the buying party. The buyer's agent is also included in the buying party. So the buying agent and the listing agent can both now go through. What would not be allowed would be a friend that just wants to see the property, an in-law or a sibling that just wants to see the property but isn't going to be living there, isn't going to be financially involved in the transaction at all, or listed on the title or the deed in any way. As I said, you still must properly clean and sanitize between private showings. I cannot emphasize the importance of this enough to try to reduce the spread and contraction of COVID. You're going to want to be following all of these. Anybody that enters the property should have a mask on. You should have hand sanitizer available for anybody that enters the property, continually cleaning, disinfecting, and you can see all the exact strict guidelines on the CA industry guidelines for showing property, which is available on our Transaction Resource Center. One change that we do have that the county has cleared is that flyers can be placed in signposts and in listed properties, or they can be mailed out or left on a doorstep. You should not interact with anybody when doing this. You should not physically hand a flyer to anybody. You should not try to knock and interact with the resident when dropping a flyer off. Just put it on their porch, put it on the door knocker. You are allowed to do this as cleared by the county, but it is clear in the state industry guidelines for showing property that any promotional material should be distributed virtually whenever possible. So I emphasize using email, doing it via mail, trying to limit the door-to-door interaction, putting them in signposts. That is a last resort, but any way that you can transfer it virtually is preferred and required. And this sort of hands-on flyer sharing is more of a last resort option, which ties into also the PED forms should still always be signed and transferred electronically. The state industry guidelines really emphasizes that unless infeasible, anything that can be done virtually or electronically should still be done virtually and electronically. Moving in, as I said, I would get into the county social distancing protocol, which is the second part of this new risk reduction order. If you're unfamiliar with the social distancing protocol completely, this is something that all businesses must complete within 2 weeks of when the new risk reduction order was released, which I believe means the deadline is either today or tomorrow. So if you have not filled one of those out yet, do so immediately. They do not need to be filled out for individual listings by those individual agents. The people that are going to need to be filling out the social distancing protocol is large brokerage offices for their physical places of work. And once it is filled out, completed, and submitted to the county, which you can all do online, and links and further instructions for that is again on our Transaction Resource Center. You should distribute that to all your staff, all your realtors, anybody that is tied into that brokerage office. Now, smaller brokerage offices and independent realtors or affiliates with no physical business address still need to fill out a social distancing protocol, but there is a box to check that you are a business with no facility towards the top, and that is the clarification that you would fall under. And then you're going to be including your mailing address for wherever you receive all of your work documents, whether that be a home, a PO box. And so your brokerage offices and your independent realtors are the ones that are going to need to be filling this out personally and submitting to the county. Everybody should either submit or should receive one from their brokerage office. So I would reach out to your office if you have not received one yet, as they may have not submitted one or may not know about it. Moving into some of the do's for showing property, as that is one of the main titles of the webinar today. So I would feel remiss if I didn't at least have a slide in on that. So going through a lot of what I've talked about so far, do's: do hold all showings virtually if possible. This is some important language that still exists in the risk reduction order, that you should be trying to do everything virtually if at all possible, and that these in-person activities are really meant to be held if any sort of virtual aspect is infeasible. Again, we're only allowing a max of one buying party per private showing, which would not include a friend or a family member that's not going to be financially involved in the transaction in any way, or be listed on the title or the deed, or truly plugged into the transaction in any manner. Where all required proper protective gear such as masks, gloves are another great way, face shields, to prevent spreading and try to maintaining that social distancing. Follow those state industry guidelines of thoroughly cleaning the property in between each showing. I know it's a lot of work, but we've come a far place to get the classification that we have right now to allow what we have in real estate, and we do not want to see that restricted again because we're not following these thorough industry guidelines to properly clean. Again, going with cleaning and masks, it's important to have hand sanitizer available for all clients, hand sanitizing soap available in the restrooms if anybody would like to wash their hands going through the showing. That is strongly suggested as well. When we're doing any sort of promotion, do not just use open house by itself, but make sure that there is something on there that says by appointment only in conjunction with it, to emphasize the point that somebody can't just walk up and go through a showing, that they really need to do a pre-electronic appointment only. Again, ensuring that all PEDs and other forms are signed virtually whenever possible, to try to limit contact, getting people to sign the PEDs before they enter the premises, before they step foot onto the property, to maintain that all liability is off the hands of the sellers and all of the agents involved. Sharing flyers and listing information virtually whenever possible, opposed to any physical copies or transferring of flyers. It is best to try to blast out via email, social media. You know, the world that we live in, there's an amazing amount of electronic information that can be passed. So I emphasize sharing things virtually whenever possible. And of course, maintaining safe social distancing whenever you are sharing a listing with your clients, the buyers, the sellers, anybody in the home, anybody that's coming to do work on the property. Make sure that everybody's keeping a safe distance. Some don'ts for showing property: again, do not hold a traditional open house. I know you've heard me say this probably about 10 times throughout the presentation already, but I cannot emphasize it enough. Also, do not hold drive up or walk up appointments. It should be electronic sign up only. Drive up and walk up appointments physically do not allow for enough social distancing to avoid people from gathering in groups outside the home, cars to pile up, and it does not allow enough time for the property to properly be cleaned in between each private showing. So make sure that we're doing it electronically and that we have enough space in between each appointment. Don't physically hand out flyers to people as they're walking up and going to the property. If you have to, put it in a signpost, put it on a chair, put it on a desk. Do not physically hand them out to individuals, and absolutely do not knock on neighbors' doors to promote any listings as you're going through the neighborhood. Do not disregard the required cleaning protocols. Again, we need to be following these to make sure that we're not forced to take any steps backwards from the allowances that we have been granted in terms of showing property. Don't allow anybody to come into the house without wearing a mask or using hand sanitizer, making sure that they disinfect themselves as much as possible. Don't touch any high contact surface areas such as handrails, countertops. Avoid using light switches as much as possible. Sinks, try to stay away from high contact area as much as physically possible. Absolutely do not let anybody into the property that has not signed a PED form. That opens up a host of liability for the sellers, yourselves, anybody involved in the transaction. And as I said, we don't want to take any steps backwards. Earlier this October, the California DRE has started to threaten forcing the requirements of the industry guidelines, more stringent enforcement more effective enforcement and possibly higher penalties. So they are starting to see this, and they want to make sure that we are all following the industry guidelines that are laid out before us. I know that this was an absolute ton of information, a wave that was just thrown at you over this past 10, 15 minutes or so. So all of the information, any link that I referenced, any document that I referenced can be found at our SCORE Transaction Resource Center. We are consistently updating this. It has all the most up-to-date information. It has links to the social distancing protocols. It has links to the most current risk reduction order. It has links to the California industry for showing guideline properties, the SCCAOR FAQs, the SCCAOR do's and the don'ts, any piece of information that you could possibly need on showing property, the real estate industry during the time of COVID is available on the Transaction Resource Center. And as we all know, as we've seen the importance that elected officials and our county officials can play during a time like this, I would be remiss with the election coming up next week if I didn't plug the fact to get out and vote. Check out our voter guide, a ton of the work that was done to allow these different classifications of real estate being deemed essential and allowing more and more of what a traditional transaction process looks like was a lot of work with our SCORE advocacy team and our county elected officials and county departments. And it just shows the importance of advocacy, voting, and electing realtor party friendly candidates. So if you haven't voted yet, please do. Don't undervote. I know the presidential ticket is a very hotly contested item, but research your local candidates, your local council members, your county officials, your state elected officials, and check out our SCORE voter guide. Below that is our contact information. If you did not have anything answered here today, or you can't find anything on the Transaction Resource Center, Jordan and myself are always available. You can email us below or give us a call, and we will do our very best to either get you an answer or get you in contact with whoever can get you the answer. And with that, I have seen questions that are starting to come through. So I will allow Jordan to start asking the questions that are in our Q&A box.
So Tim, what's the amount of time that should be allowed between showings?
There's no strict timeline, and you all would know that better than myself. I am not out at these listings. I am not going through and engaging in these cleaning protocols. So I would say there's no set amount of time. It depends on who's going through and cleaning it, how large the house is, and I think that could greatly vary. So I think that's something that our members need to gauge, and they will learn with experience over time and reading through the cleaning protocols themselves. They will be able to make the best estimate of how much time it will take to properly clean the property.
What is the definition of properly clean and sanitized that adheres to SCCAOR regulations?
That definition could be found in the industry guidelines for showing property. Off the top of my head, I do not remember all requirements that is deemed for a properly sanitized home in between showings, but it lays out the guidelines for exactly what that is. So I would say just following those industry guidelines and everything that's in them would classify as properly cleaning and sanitizing.
So there are some situations where we have people who are not on a loan or on a title, but they're involved in the decision of making the purchase. For example, a couple where only one person's on the loan and title due to possibly poor credit or having no employment, or a family purchasing a home and having their parents who are influential in their purchase decision, or possibly parents that are going to be living with their children. Shouldn't these people be considered part of the buying party?
Those are very specific anecdotal cases. The first example of a couple going in on a property together, both people are obviously going to be living in the property. Anybody that's going to be living in the property, I would say, would count as that buying party. So in that example, if one of the spouses isn't going to be listed on the title but is still going to be living there, absolutely. In the second case, Again, if the parents are possibly going to be living there, I would say that they would be included in the buying party as well, or if they're providing any sort of financial assistance. Um, Now, if it's just a parents that are concerned about the decision their children are making on purchasing a home, that gets into a real gray area. I would consider reaching out to CAR Legal on that one, the CAR Legal hotline, because I don't feel confident giving a decision on that one way or the other. But I urge you to use your best judgment in situations like that, in what you think may be considered a buying party, or reach out to CAR Legal for a concrete definition.
So for the PED forms, can the buyer sign one form for various properties, or do they have to sign one per property?
It should be one PED per property. So even if it is the same buyer for several different properties, it should be an individual PED for each property that they are going to.
If anyone has any more questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A now, and we'll be able to ask Tim. Tim, is there a timeline for when traditional open houses will be allowed again?
This is a question that we get a lot, and I think unfortunately it's going to be some time until we see what would be considered a truly traditional open house, what we saw in a pre-COVID world, based on the restrictions that are continually going to be in place at the statewide level on indoor gatherings and these strict cleaning protocols. I do not see any time in the near future where we will move back to a pre-COVID world with traditional open houses. I would imagine that it would be sometime after a vaccine is safely implemented nationwide. But again, that is something far above my pay grade, and all I can say is that it will likely be several months.
We'll give it a minute here for any more questions that are coming in.
Of course, please take your time. I know this was a lot of information. I will leave the link up on the screen for the Transaction Resource Center and the SCORE Voter Guide. You can be checking out that Transaction Resource Center and see if you may have any questions. We will leave the screen up. Also, the downloadable version of that graphic you see on the right side of the screen is on the Transaction Resource Center if you would like to redistribute that. Otherwise, I take it as my presentation was thorough, and thank you for your time, but it looks like we may have a couple more questions popping in.
Yeah, so we have a clarification that one PAD can be used for multiple properties being visited on the same day.
If it's on the same day, that would possibly be okay. I would need to double check. I don't want to give a firm answer one way or the other. CAR has been much more involved on the PED process than we have been locally, so you may be able to find a concrete answer at the statewide level. But if you do not, I will please reach out to me via email, and I will try to get an answer for you.
Here's some more questions coming in. There are some agents that somebody has seen doing drive-up open houses. What is being done about this? And
I'm sorry, Jordan, can you repeat that question, please? I believe you cut out a little bit.
so there are some agents doing drive-up open houses, and this person is wondering what's being done about this from a CAR level.
From a CAR and SCORE level, this is something that we are trying to track down and limit as much as possible. Unfortunately, we do not have the massive amount of tools and resources to incredibly effectively do this. I would say your best tool is professional standards, because again, as we've seen at the county and statewide level, there is strict fines and penalties for not following any of these guidelines or risk reduction orders. But it is very tough to enforce it. So SCORE and the county and CAR and the state are all working together as collaboratively as possible to try to crack down on and enforce and limit people who are not following the risk reduction orders and the industry guidelines for showing property. And I would just like to say thank you to everybody who does stay on top of the updates, who does strictly follow all of the rules and requirements put forth in front of them, because you are the people that lead a good name to the Realtor brand and the Realtor party. And we are doing our very best to limit those people that may not know or not wishing to follow the guidelines in place.
So for vacant properties, who is responsible for the sanitation after showings?
The listing agent is going to be the one responsible for sanitation after showing a property. If a listing agent has faith in a buying agent to go through and sanitize it, I suppose that would be all right, but that is something that I would strongly recommend against, as it is the listing agent and the sellers who are viable for making sure that those are being implemented. So that is who that burden would fall on.
Can we market on MLS and ask people to contact us to set up a showing and process a PED on the public remarks?
I believe so. I would reach out to MLS directly about that, but I do not see any issue with that.
If there are more than 2 people in a buying party, does everyone need to sign the PED? And what are kids to sign? What age are kids supposed to sign?
Everybody should be signing a PED, no matter how many people are going through. I believe there is a category in the PED for minors who are accompanying that don't need to sign, but simply need to be listed. And I believe that that is the legal definition of a minor, which is anybody under the age of 18, and anybody else in the buying party over the age of 18 should be filling out and signing on that one PED form.
Does a broker need to sign or initial the PED form as well?
The broker does not need to sign or initial the PED form. To my knowledge, it is sufficient for the listing agent or the buying agent to sign that PED form.
Is the listing agent's responsibility to sanitize after showing a recent change? This has been the buyer's agent responsibility up until now.
I will double check on that and go through the industry guidelines for showing property, but I was under the impression that the listing agent was responsible for PEDs properly being filled out and implementing cleaning protocols. So further regarding that question on which agent would be responsible for the cleaning protocol, it does not specifically list it in the industry guidelines for showing property, but based off some of the aspects that are required in terms of having hand sanitizer available and making sure different aspects of the property are cleaned per showing, it would seem logical to me that that would be the responsibility of the listing agent, but I will defer to any CAR form that exists and try to provide maybe some further clarification on that by reaching out to CAR staff.
Well, that's all the questions that we have.
With that, then, I think we have given it enough time asking for the questions to come in. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending. Again, if I did not sufficiently answer any one of the questions that you may have asked, please refer to our Transaction Resource Center or email us at advocacy@score.com, and I will do my best to try to answer that question or refer you to somebody who can. Be safe. Best of luck with your listings out there, and thank you for your time today.